Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin and the end of quantitative tightening. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. So, Bitcoin right now is coming in at around $87,000. Now, a lot of people are perplexed, right? They're like, well, quantitative tightening is coming to an end on December 1st. Why are we seeing Bitcoin drop into that? Well, first of all, you should know that actually the exact same thing happened back last cycle when QT ended. The other thing that people should remember is that the announcement date that QT ends is not actually necessarily the same date that the balance sheet of the Fed starts going up. Now, that might seem confusing. You might say, well, if you look at 2019, you can see the balance sheet of the Fed started to go up in September. Now, you might be led to believe that because the balance sheet of the Fed went up in September, you might be led to believe that because of that, you might think, oh, well, that means QT ended then. But in reality, if you dig into the mechanics, the Fed announced the end of quantitative tightening. They announced it on July 31st, 2019, and said on August 1st, QT comes to an end. So they announced it on July 30th. So let's look at what Bitcoin did on July 30th. Right here. You can see Bitcoin dumped into the announcement. It then rallied, but then Bitcoin continued to not really go anywhere, even though the balance sheet eventually started to go up. Bitcoin continued to bleed, even though the balance sheet was going up. This is what I've tried to communicate to people for years, right? For years, that just because you have the transition from QT to QE doesn't necessarily mean anything. What did mean something was when you had a panic and then the balance sheet really started to explode, right? That is where things change. So right now, we're not even in the phase where the balance sheet goes up. There's a good chance going into December that the same thing that happened in 2019 is going to happen again. Where essentially back then in August of 2019, it took until, mid-August for that last batch of Treasury maturities to settle. And maybe the same thing's going to happen again now, right? Like, it seems like a likely scenario where it could take a few weeks. You could argue that we might not even notice the balance sheet starting to go up until 2026. But by then, it might be more obvious to people that we're in a bear market, Now, that doesn't mean that nothing can put in new all-time highs. Obviously, some cryptocurrencies are putting in new all-time highs. But the hard part with Bitcoin right now is that, it's been dropping throughout the last couple of months. And we know that while it might drop back down and then get a nice rally back up, there is still a decent chance that until the Fed really starts to increase the balance sheet more, and when they really start to drop those interest rates more, it might not have the desired effect, right? Like, it doesn't mean you're not going to have counter trend rallies. But the reality is that what I'm saying, I think, is the most likely scenario right now, is I'm saying that this 2019 bear market that happened as quantitative tightening ended and QE began, and as interest rates came down, that I think is what's happening right now, right? Like, I think that same thing is happening right now. And so you're going to have some rallies by Bitcoin, absolutely. And I've said many times, like, you will likely have a rally back up to the 200-day moving average. I think that will happen. But that doesn't mean it has to happen today, right? Like, it could still be a few weeks away. Who knows exactly when it's going to happen? I could see a scenario where this bleed continues for a little bit longer, and then you have 3 months in a row, potentially, that are red. I mean, I hope December is green. in honesty. I mean, in all honesty, I hope December is green. I mean, it would be nice to have some relief here. But there does exist a scenario where you have these monthly returns, kind of like 2021, where you had 3 red months in a row, November, December, and January, and then February and March were green. What if we're front running that and October, November, December are red in preparation for the 2026 bear market? But you could argue that this initial drop already potentially gets you halfway through the bear market. And usually what happens halfway through the bear market is you get a counter trend rally, just like Bitcoin got in February and March of 2022. So maybe that's what happens, right? Like maybe Bitcoin just continues to not go up and maybe either goes sideways or down for the rest of the year. A lot of people pricing in the 2026 bear market. And then potentially in early 2026, you get that counter trend rally, and people are like, oh, what if 2025 was the bear market year? Like, what if that's the red year and 2026 can be green? Now, unfortunately, I think 2026 will be red, but there might be a brief period where people think it will end up being green. Now, what I think is to watch for is that if this is like the 2019 bear market, you'll notice that it took about, what, how many weeks? About 6 months or so until we broke through that downtrend line. About 6 months. You could argue we haven't even established the downtrend line yet. I mean, who knows? Like, I mean, it's going to depend on whenever we get that move back up. Hopefully before we go below these lows, because that's what happened last cycle, right? There was a low, Bitcoin dropped, got a counter trend rally, and then that's what ultimately set that sort of that macro lower high that then it eventually broke through in the next bull market. You can see it did that here as well, and then we got the recession, right? The pandemic-induced recession. So because of that, and if you look at like monthly returns in 2022, you can see that February, March were green, April, May, June were red. So if it follows, that means, maybe January, February green, and then March, April, and May are red. And that might get you through most of the bear market. There's a chance it could end as early as May. I wouldn't say it's my base case, but if you look at MicroStrategy last cycle, the bottom essentially was in May of 2022, and then it essentially wicked below it later on. But the bottom came a lot quicker than people thought. And this is playing out in a lot of similar ways, but you have this MicroStrategy, did not hold support there, right? It went down further, then got a counter trend rally back up, and then the final leg of the bear market happened, right? So you could argue that people are just kind of hoping, waiting for that move back up by MicroStrategy, and if it comes back up here, you still might then get the final drop of the of that happens in 2026, right? That 2026 bear market. But again, usually at the end of the post-halving year is where you kind of establish that the bear market in the midterm year is occurring, right? You drop, you break support, and then things roll over more clearly in the midterm year, right? Like if you look at 2021, you can see structural, we sort of broke down, we came back up, but because we had gone through this entire phase without going anywhere, by the time we got to the midterm year, investors finally accepted the bear market. I'm saying, like, I think that something like that could happen again, where investors finally accept a bear market. Now, there does exist a slight chance that Bitcoin could go back up to an all-time high, but it's not my base case. It's something to maybe just keep in the back of your mind of like, okay, if you're going to hold anything in crypto, Bitcoin is a better hold than essentially everything else. If you look at like the weekly RSI, you can see that it has in fact broken down. And normally when it breaks down, that's confirmation of the bear market, right? Like many times where you get these more sustained breakdowns, it's, the bear market is in. But I mean, if you look at Ethereum, you can see that it technically broke down, and then it still somehow put in a higher high on the USD valuation, even though their RSI was much lower. I will say this: I mean, if there is a higher high, I don't think it would be much higher, and it would just be a final divergence. But who knows if that's actually going to happen? I feel like what the most likely outcome is right now is that just like 2019, Bitcoin topped a few months before, before QT ended. right? So if we overlay here total assets held by the Federal Reserve, and you look here, you can see that Bitcoin topped out a few months before the balance sheet started to go up, right? So it topped in June. The balance sheet started to go up in September. So July, August, and then September. This time, what if Bitcoin just tops here October, and then you have November, December, and then you start noticing the balance sheet going up in January of 2026. And then therefore you have the same thing where Bitcoin tops 3 months or so before the balance sheet really starts to go up. Now, I've had a lot of people be like, well, what about Bitcoin dominance? Because, you're still bullish on Bitcoin dominance, and maybe you're staying bullish on it too long, and, which they have a point, right? Like, they have a point. Maybe it's time to retire it. But remember, I will remind people that I think there's a reality. There's a lot of people waiting for the end of QT in the hopes that it'll finally pump their altcoin bags. And the reality is like, well, what if it doesn't? Like, what if it's the same type of people that were waiting for it right here, and then the Fed ended QT right there, where alt Bitcoin pairs were like 0.35, and then they still dropped down into September, even though the Fed had said QT's over, but the balance sheet still continued to go down for about one more month. So I think that's kind of how you might get the final unwind, right? Is you have everyone who's waiting for QE to save them in December. What if it doesn't? And then they capitulate. You get this drop by alt Bitcoin pairs back down here into January. Then QE starts. Then alt Bitcoin pairs start to go back up, but it could still be while Bitcoin is not in a bull market, right? I mean, when alt Bitcoin pairs were going up over here, Bitcoin was actually in a bear market. So you could have the same thing where like they drop down and then they start to go back up, but it just means that you could be in a bear market. It just might be that alts are rallying against Bitcoin because they already got annihilated for the last 4 years. So, that they're just not dropping as much because they already dropped like 99.9% against the king. So that's kind of what I see happening right now. Like I see, Bitcoin bouncing here and there on certain headlines about QE and lower interest rates and whatnot. But I think it's going to take some time for the Fed to really lower rates and to really ramp up printing where it needs to be to sort of justify things, especially given all this macro uncertainty, especially if you think about things like, the unemployment rate and whatnot continuing to head higher, So these are, and by the way, that was something that also went up back over here, but again, it went up due to a pandemic-induced recession, but it still nevertheless did go up, regardless of what the reason for it was. So I just wanted to like kind of clear things up there that like, yeah, QT is ending, but because that final batch of treasury maturities like won't actually finalize until potentially a few weeks from now, you might not see the balance sheet of the Fed go up right away. And that could be one of those moments to be like, oh, okay, maybe QE isn't going to save everyone else's altcoin. Not theirs, of course. Everyone else's. And then those people decide to capitulate, and then all Bitcoin pairs drop down. And then finally we get sort of a transition in the market cycle in 2026 where alts start to behave differently against Bitcoin because QT is clearly over and money printing has begun, but maybe it's not quite enough to justify a move like this. Doesn't mean you won't eventually get one, but what if it's reserved for next cycle, right? I mean, like, what if this phase of that 2019 move just ends up being the 2026, the bear market that kind of starts in Q4, but continues into 2026. And then everyone sits around scratching their head, like, thinking this time is going to be different. But in reality, we got the same bear market that we always get. And if you look at the ROI of Bitcoin after the cycle peak and compare, the current one to the last two, it's not like it looks that different, right? I mean, it looks kind of the same so far. If anything, it's doing better than the last two at this point in the bear market. So I just wanted to throw that your guys' way. Just something to think about with quantitative tightening. Again, trade the market you have, not the market you want, right? If we're in a bear market, we're in a bear market. Like if you're an investor, you're going to experience multiple bear markets throughout your lifetime. Multiple bear markets. If anything, they just create opportunities, right? That's what they create. They create opportunities for those who are patient and stick around. And for those who panic and leave, I mean, obviously they don't create opportunities for those people, but trade the market you have, not the market you want, right? I mean, all of us want Bitcoin to rally to 200K, but that doesn't mean it's going to happen. Doesn't mean it won't ever happen. I do believe it will eventually happen. It just, I think people tend to overestimate what Bitcoin can do in the short term, and then they underestimate what it does over the long term, right? We get so worked up on what happens like on a monthly basis, that we forget about like, this overall trend that happens, And so what, right? If we go through a bear market, it happens every 4 years, and this time doesn't have to be different just because we want it to be. So I think that you could look at the QT narrative and the interest rate environment narrative and justify a similar type of bear market as the one we got in 2019. I think you can justify it. I think a lot of people are going to sit around and try to explain why it's different. But at the end of the day, the odds that we look back on 2025 and then going into 2026, the odds that we look back on it and we're like, yeah, it was just a bear market like all other bear markets, I think they're really high, and I mean, yeah, there's a chance I'm wrong, and maybe Bitcoin does go to a new all-time high before things truly end for a year. But the good news is if we are in a bear market, we're already, 2 months into it, and normally they're about a year. Right, so look at the positive way. Anyways, guys, we'll wrap it up there. Thank you guys for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe, give the video a thumbs up, and again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.